I'm Delia Kowalski, 38 years old, and I spent nearly 20 years as an Army combat medic, keeping other people breathing on the worst days of their lives. For years, I gave the service everything I had, and on one convoy, I gave it my leg. But when I finally arrived at my own award ceremony, in a plain dress and leaning on a cane, an officer took one look and decided I did not belong, and had me walk toward the door. What happened in the next 60 seconds changed the way I see myself forever. Have you ever been dismissed by someone who never took 2 seconds to actually see you? If so, tell me your story in the comments. You are not alone. Before I get into what happened, let me know where you're tuning in from. And if you have ever had to stand up for yourself after being wronged, hit that like button and subscribe. The hardest patient I ever had was my own left leg. I had spent almost 20 years teaching other people how to keep breathing, how to hold pressure on a wound while the world came apart around them, how to stay calm when calm was the last thing their body wanted. And then, one afternoon, in a therapy room that smelled like rubber mats and antiseptic, I sat on the edge of a table and tried to make my own leg lift 3 inches off the floor, and it would not do it. So I know a little about how it feels to be strong your whole life and then have your own body tell you no. I grew up in a mill town where the biggest employer had already started closing its doors, and the recruiter's office had better lighting than anywhere else on the block. I did not join because I loved the flag, though I came to. I joined because I wanted a skill that meant something that could not be taken away by a plant shutting down or a bad year. I picked combat medic off a list because the man behind the desk said it was hard, and I was 18 and stubborn enough to hear that as a dare. The first week of medic training, I fainted. Not from the blood exactly, but from the smell of it, mixed with the heat and the fear that I had made a terrible mistake. My instructor was a lean, weathered sergeant who had seen more than he ever said out loud. He did not laugh at me. He waited until I got up off the floor, and then he told me the one thing that shaped the next 2 decades of my life. He said, "A medic does not get to be scared out loud. You can shake all you want on the inside. Your hands stay quiet. Quiet hands." That became my whole standard. Everything else about a person can be falling apart, and it usually is when they need you, but your hands have to stay steady, because your hands are the promise you are making them. I got good at it. I deployed for the first time at 21, a brand new sergeant with a stripe I had not fully grown into, and I learned the difference between the training version of a bad day and the real one. I learned that under fire, nobody cares what you look like or how tall you are or whether your voice cracks. They care whether you can get to them and whether your hands stay quiet when you do. For the first time in my life, I was measured by exactly one thing, and it was the only measurement I had ever trusted. The uniform never once asked me to be pretty. It asked me to be useful. That was the cleanest deal I ever made. I made staff sergeant at 25, senior medic for a line company, responsible for the young medics coming up behind me. I made sergeant first class at 31. The years stacked up the way they do in deployments and duty stations and the faces of people I patched who I never saw again, and a few I did. I was not chasing anything. I was not building toward a medal or a moment. I was just doing the work, and the work was enough. There was a boy in my second deployment, a private not even 19, who took a bad fall from a vehicle and cracked something loose inside himself that I could not see and could barely feel for. I sat with him for 40 minutes on the floor of a cargo bay while we waited for a bird, and I did not have a single dramatic thing to do for him. I just held his hand and kept my voice level and lied to him gently about how fine he was going to be. He lived. Years later, he sent me a photograph of a baby I will never meet. And there was no medal for that day, no citation, no ceremony, and I have carried that afternoon in my chest longer than I have carried anything with a ribbon attached. That is the part the medals never quite reach. The real work is mostly quiet. It is mostly a level voice and a hand that does not shake. In a room nobody will ever hear about. I learned the branches of the human body the way some people learn scripture, not to recite, but to lean on. I learned which wounds lie to you and which ones tell the truth, which soldier who is screaming is actually going to be fine, and which one who has gone quiet is the one you sprint to. I learned to read a person in the first 2 seconds, and I was proud of that skill, and I did not yet understand that a whole ceremony would one day be built on a stranger reading me in the first 2 seconds and getting it completely wrong. We all take our shortcuts. Mine had saved lives. His would nearly cost me the proudest day of mine, which is exactly why what happened at that ceremony landed the way it did. Because recognition had never been the point for me. I had spent a career being the person you do not notice until the worst second of your life, and I had made my peace with being invisible. I did not know that being invisible was a habit the Army would one day take almost too literally. I was 38, 8 months out from the injury that put me in that therapy room, when my battle buddy came to visit me at the medical center. Her name is Tamara Boone, and we had been sergeants together back when we were both too young to be trusted with anything. She sat down across from me while I worked my leg through its slow, humiliating set of extensions, and she had a look on her face like she was carrying good news she was not sure I wanted. She said, "They approved it, Dee, the Silver Star. There's going to be a ceremony, and for once you're going to have to stand still and let people look at you." I did not feel joy. I want to be honest about that because I think people expect a moment like that to feel like fireworks. What I felt was something closer to dread. I thought about the corporal I'd kept alive with my hands, a kid named Isaiah Mott, and I thought that if anyone deserved a room full of people standing up, it was him for surviving, not me for doing my job. I thought about standing at the front of a room while 200 people looked at me, and I did not know how to do that. I had never once in 20 years been the patient. I did not know how to be the one everyone watched. I looked at the cane leaning against the wall by the door, the ugly gray thing I had started to hate, and I already knew that the one thing I did not know how to do was the exact thing they were about to ask me to do. Stand still, be seen, let people look. I had run through gunfire to reach wounded soldiers. I had knelt in the open, with rounds coming in, and kept my hands quiet. And the thing that scared me was a folding chair at the front of a theater with my name on it. Tamara stayed for another hour that afternoon. She did not talk about the ceremony again because she knows me and she knew I needed to put it down for a while. Instead, she told me about her kids, about the leaking roof on her house, about a mutual friend from our sergeant days who had finally made sergeant major. Ordinary things, the scaffolding of an ordinary life, which is the exact thing you cling to when your body has stopped being ordinary. Before she left, she squeezed my shoulder and said, "You are going to hate every second of that ceremony, and then in 10 years, it is going to be the thing you are gladdest you did." I told her she was probably right. I did not know yet how right or how wrong or how differently that day would go than either of us imagined. In the weeks before the ceremony, I got a long, slow education in what it means to be a wounded woman out of uniform. Out of the uniform, with a cane, I learned I could become furniture in about 4 seconds. I would walk onto the post I had served for years, in a plain jacket and jeans because that was what fit over the brace. And I would watch people's eyes slide off me the way they slide off a road sign they have seen 1,000 times. Nobody was cruel. That is the part people never understand. It is almost never cruelty. It is just a room full of people deciding, fast, that you are not the story. A young soldier held a door for me and called me ma'am in the tone that means, "Please stop existing near me." A clerk waved me toward the wrong line and then looked annoyed when I was in it. The cane made me invisible, invisible at the same time. Invisible as a person, visible as a weakness. People saw the cane before they saw my face. And once they saw the cane, they were done looking. I did not blame them exactly. I had probably done the same thing 100 times myself, back when I was healthy and busy and sure that the tired-looking woman with the cane was somebody's mother, somebody's wife, somebody who had wandered in. That is the quiet arrogance of being able-bodied. You think the categories you sort people into are the truth, when really they are just shortcuts, and shortcuts are where mistakes live. There was one afternoon that stuck with me. I was at the commissary, leaning on the cart more than I wanted to admit, and a young soldier, sharp and squared away and full of the certainty that youth and 2 working legs give you, stepped in front of me to grab something off a shelf. He did not see me. Not because he was rude, but because I had become the kind of thing his eyes were trained to skip. I stood there for a second, with my hand on the cart, and I thought, this is what it is now. This is what I traded the leg for. Not pain exactly, just this soft, constant erasure. This being sorted out of the room before I had said a word. I had spent 20 years being the person everyone was desperate to find when things went wrong. and now I was the person nobody bothered to see when things were going right. I did not know how to hold both of those facts in the same body, and I told myself it did not matter. I told myself that the people who knew me, and strangers did not have to. That is a comforting thing to tell yourself right up until a stranger with a clipboard is the one standing between you and your own name being read aloud. Then came the fitting and the small logistical fact that set the whole day in motion. I went in to try on my Army service uniform for the first time since the injury. The dark blue coat and trousers, the uniform I had worn with quiet pride for years. And I could not get the trousers over the leg brace. The hardware, the rigid frame that held my knee together, would not go under the fabric. The tailor was a kind, honest woman with pins in her mouth, and she tried, and then she stopped trying and told me the truth. She said, "We can let it out, Sergeant, but not that far, not with the hardware." I stood there in the coat with no trousers that would fit, and I understood that I might have to attend my own award in civilian clothes. It seemed like a small thing. It was not a small thing. In a world that reads people by their packaging, I was about to show up to the most military event of my life, dressed like a civilian. I called the ceremonies administrative office to sort out the details. A harried voice on the other end told me the seating and check-in would be run by the general's protocol officer, that the list was locked, and that I should just check in at the table. I asked a clarifying question and got a sigh in return. I recognized the sound. It was the sound of a system that had decided in advance that I was a complication. When I mentioned it to Tamara, she rolled her eyes and told me about the new protocol captain. She called him a clipboard with a haircut. A man who cared more about the general's visit going smoothly than about the soldiers the ceremony was supposedly for. She said, "Watch out for the protocol guy. He treats the seating chart like it is classified." I shrugged it off. I had survived enemy fire, 3 deployments, and 8 months of physical therapy. I was not going to be undone by a captain with a clipboard. That is the thing about confidence, built on 20 years of competence. It does not occur to you that the danger is not that you cannot handle the room. The danger is that the room will decide it does not have to handle you. The night before the ceremony, I hung the unworn dress uniform back in the closet and laid out a simple, dark civilian dress instead. I stood there looking at it, and I told myself the clothes did not matter. I told myself that the medal was the medal no matter what I wore. That a silver star does not care about a dress code. I believed it, too. I was wrong, but I believed it. The clothes were going to matter more than anything I owned. I did not sleep well that night. That surprised me. I had slept in worse places than a warm bed the night before an award, slept in vehicles and on cots, and once, memorably, sitting upright against a wall because it was the only dry spot for 100 feet. But the night before the ceremony, I lay awake and ran the day forward in my head, over and over, the way you rehearse anything you are afraid of. I pictured checking in at the table. I pictured finding my seat. I pictured the general saying my name and me standing up on the leg, hoping it would hold, hoping I would not have to grab a chair. Not once in all that rehearsing did I picture the actual thing that happened. You never do. The disaster you plan for is never the one that comes. The morning of the ceremony, a therapy appointment ran long. That is the boring, human way these things start. Not with a villain twirling a mustache, but with a physical therapist saying, "One more set," and a clock I could not argue with. By the time I got to the post theater, I was 15 minutes late, moving as fast as the cane would let me, my heart going harder than the walk warranted. The big doors were already swinging shut. Inside, I could see the reserved front rows where the award recipients sat, and I aimed myself at them because that was where I belonged. I did not make it 10 feet. A captain stepped into my path, harried, scanning a clipboard, a man about 33 with a fresh haircut and the tight, managed look of someone for whom this day was a performance review. Captain Grant Sedgwick. He did not look at my face first. He looked at the dress and the cane and the clipboard, in that order. He said, "Ma'am, this section is for award recipients and their commands. You are not on my list. Are you here with a family?" I told him, as calmly as I could, that I was a recipient. I watched the sentence not land. He looked at me again, the dress, the cane, the lack of a uniform, and I could see him running me through the same fast sorting machine everyone had been running me through for weeks. Civilian, confused, lost, a problem to be managed before the general arrived. He said, "In that dress? With a cane? This is a military ceremony, ma'am. If you are not on the list, I need you to step back." I reached for my identification. I said I could show him who I was, but he was already turning away, already lifting his hand, already deciding. He did not want an answer. He wanted the aisle clear. There's a particular kind of person who, when the facts threaten the plan, chooses the plan. He had a general coming and a chart that did not have me on it in the place he expected, and I was easier to remove than to understand. I want to be fair to who I was in that moment, too, because it matters to the story. I could have handled it louder. I could have said, clearly and firmly, in my sergeant's voice, the voice that has stopped panic in its tracks on a bad night, "Captain, my name is on that list, and if you look one line down instead of at my shoes, you will find it." I had that in me. But I was tired from the appointment, and I was off balance on the leg, and there is a thing that happens to you after months of being erased. You start to flinch before the erasure even lands. You start to make yourself smaller to save everyone the trouble. I am not proud of that part. But I understand her, the woman I was by those doors, and I have forgiven her for not fighting harder because she had been fighting for 8 straight months just to walk into that building at all. He signaled to the military police sergeant posted by the doors, a young man named Cody Farrow. And here's the part that still sits with me, because it tells you how these things actually work. Sedgwick did not say, "Please verify her identity." He framed it as a disturbance because a disturbance is easier to justify. He said, "Sergeant, can you help this lady find her way out? We are about to start." Farrow came over. He was maybe 26 and he was uneasy. I could see it. Something about the whole thing did not sit right with him, but he was a sergeant, and a captain had given him an order in front of a filling room, and he was not equipped in that moment to weigh a captain's certainty against his own doubt. He put a light hand near my arm and said quietly, almost apologetically, "Ma'am, let us just step outside a second, okay?" I had a choice. I could make a scene in front of 200 soldiers, plant my cane, and raise my voice and demand that this captain look at my identification. Or I could let a kid half my service walk me to the door. I have spent my whole life keeping my hands quiet. Everything in me that was proud wanted to fight, and everything in me that was disciplined knew that the fight would become the story, and I did not want to be a story about a woman yelling. So I kept my hands quiet. I let him turn me toward the doors. We started up the side aisle. The cane tapped on the polished floor. I was thinking about how I would get home, whether I could sit in the parking lot until it was over, whether I would tell Tamara or just let it disappear. And then behind us the hall went still. Major General Harold Ballard had stepped to the podium. The room settled into that particular silence a room makes when a general stands up. He welcomed everyone, and then he began, as these things begin, with the first citation. His voice carried to every corner of that theater, including the back corner where a young MP was walking a woman with a cane toward the exit. He said, "For conspicuous gallantry and intrepidity in action, the Silver Star is awarded to Sergeant First Class Delia Kowalski." And then there was a pause, a beat too long. The aide beside the podium leaned in and murmured something, and I knew without hearing it what it was, because I could feel the room begin to move. He was telling the general that the recipient did not appear to be seated. Heads turned. First a few, then a wave of them, 200 faces looking for the woman who had just been named and finding her by the doors, on a cane, with a military police sergeant's hand on her arm. Captain Sedgwick followed the turning heads the way you follow a sound in the dark, not wanting to know what it is. His eyes found me by the doors. His clipboard was still in his hand. I watched the color leave his face. I watched a man understand in real time exactly what he had just done, in front of a general, in front of the entire post. Cody Farrow's hand came off my arm like he had touched a stove. For a moment, nobody moved. 200 people, a general at a podium, and me standing by the exit with the cane I had learned to hate. And I understood that the dress and the cane, the two things Captain Sedgwick had used to disqualify me, were about to become the most decorated things in the room. I did not gloat. I want to be clear about that, because I know the version of this story where the woman spins around and delivers a devastating line, and the whole room erupts. That is not what happened, and it is not who I am. What happened is that I stood very still for one breath, and I let the silence do what silence does, and then I made the only choice that mattered. I gently freed my arm from Sergeant Farrow, who let go instantly, and I turned toward the front of the room. Then I walked. It was maybe 100 feet from those doors to that stage. I had crossed 100 feet under fire, in the open, with rounds coming in, and it took less out of me than that aisle did. The cane tapped in the silence. Every step was deliberate, because every step had to be, because the leg would not let me hurry, and so I did not try. I walked the length of that theater slowly, in a plain dark dress, past row after row of soldiers in their dress uniforms, and I kept my chin level and my eyes on the general. And I did not let my face do anything at all. Behind me, I would learn later, Cody Farrow came to attention. On his own, nobody told him to. As I passed the rows, I saw people begin to stand, unsure at first, the way a crowd stands when it does not yet know the rule, but knows one is being written. I thought, absurdly, about the road. About the actual moment the citation was describing, which almost nobody in that theater could picture correctly because they had never been on a road like that. They were imagining something cinematic. The truth had been louder and dirtier and much faster than anything a movie shows you. I had not felt brave on that road. I had felt terrified and extremely busy, which it turns out are not opposites. Bravery is not the absence of the terror. It is the busyness winning. It is your training taking your hands while your mind screams, and your hands staying quiet because you trained them to. Walking up that aisle, I felt more exposed than I had felt on the road, because on the road I had a job, and here I had only myself to carry, and myself was the heaviest thing I had lifted in a year. Halfway up the aisle, my leg gave a warning, that small electric buckle it does when I have asked too much of it. I did not stop. I planted the cane and let it take the weight for one extra beat, and then I kept going, and if anyone noticed, they had the grace to pretend they did not. I was not going to fall in that room. I had decided that much. Whatever else the day did to me, I was going to reach that stage on my own 2 feet and one good stick, and I did. Major General Ballard met me at the front. He did not make a spectacle of it. He is an old soldier, and old soldiers know that the loudest thing you can do in a moment like that is be quiet. He leaned in, just for me, and he said, "Low. Sergeant, I apologize for how you got to this stage. Now let me tell these people who you are." And he turned to the room and he read the full citation. Not the one-line version, the whole thing. He told them about the convoy, about the ambush, about the fire that pinned the element down on a road with no cover. He told them how Sergeant First Class Kowalski had moved through that fire, not once but 3 times to pull wounded soldiers to the shelter of a disabled vehicle. He told them about a corporal with a wound that should have killed him in 90 seconds, and how she had knelt over him in the open and kept him breathing with her bare hands until the medevac could get in. And how she had taken shrapnel to the leg and kept working anyway because a medic does not get to be scared out loud, and her hands stayed quiet. In the second row, a young man stood up. Corporal Isaiah Mott, 24 years old, the soldier I'd kept alive on that road. He was on his feet before he could think about it, and he brought his hand up in a salute, and his jaw was working like a man trying not to come apart. He held it. And then, one by one, and then all at once, the rest of the room came to its feet, and the theater filled with the sound of 200 people standing for a woman who, 90 seconds earlier, they had watched being walked out the door. I have spent a career being unseen. It is a thing you choose. As a medic, you want to be the person nobody notices until they need you, and then you want to be the person who is already there. And standing at the front of that room, finally, unbearably seen, I understood something I had been getting wrong for weeks. I did not want them to stand for the medal. I wanted them to know that the person they almost walked out the door was the same person some of their sons came home to. The dress had not disqualified me. The cane had not disqualified me. They were not the reasons I did not belong. They were the proof that I did. I had earned every inch of that limp on the same road where I earned the star. I found Isaiah's face in the crowd while the general read. He was crying, openly, the unashamed way that only very young men and very old men allow themselves, and he was saluting, and his arm did not waver. I held his eyes for a moment because I needed to, because in the whole turning, roaring room, he was the one person who knew exactly what that road had been. The one person for whom the citation was not a story, but a memory with his own blood in it. Everything I had done that day on that road, I had done so that this specific young man could stand in this specific room and cry. If the medal meant anything, it meant him, upright and breathing and 24 years old. The general pinned the silver star to my dress, over my heart, on the plain civilian fabric that Captain Sedgwick had decided was not military enough for his ceremony. And across the room, standing rigid and alone, while everyone around him rose, was Captain Grant Sedgwick, understanding exactly what he had done, and beginning to understand that no one was going to have to punish him, because he was going to do that himself for a very long time. I did not look at him for long. I want to tell you I felt some clean flash of triumph when I saw his face, but I did not. What I felt mostly was tired, and underneath the tired, something that surprised me, which was a small, unwelcome flicker of pity. I knew that face. I had worn a version of it myself, the face of a person who has just realized they got something badly, publicly wrong. It is one of the worst feelings a decent person can have. And the fact that he was feeling it told me he was, somewhere under the clipboard, a decent person. That flicker of pity is the reason the rest of the story went the way it did. If I had hated him, I would have wanted to break him. Because I only pitied him, I ended up able to use him instead. After the ceremony, they brought me into a side room, and the temperature in there was very different from the theater. The garrison command was furious on my behalf. The general's aide was furious. Ballard himself was not loud, but he was cold in the way that senior officers get cold, which is worse than loud. They had watched a decorated soldier get marched toward the exit of her own award ceremony, and someone was going to answer for it. They handed me a lever. That is really what it was. Ballard asked me directly, in front of witnesses, whether I wanted to file a formal complaint against Captain Sedgwick. He made it clear that if I did, it would be taken seriously, that the incident was documented by 200 witnesses, that a young captain's career was, in that moment, sitting in my hands. One word, and I could have ended a man's career in the time it took to sign a form. I thought about it. I want to be honest, because the version where the hero is instantly gracious is not quite true. For a second, I thought about every time someone had looked at the cane instead of my face, every sigh on the phone, every eye that slid off me, and I felt the pull of it. It would have been so easy, and it would have felt for about an hour like justice. But I have knelt over enough people to know the difference between a wound and a scar, and I did not want to hand a young man a wound just because he had handed me an insult. So I told the general no. I declined the complaint. And then I set a condition, because grace without a boundary is just permission. I said, I do not want his job, sir. I want him to spend a day at the medical center, not as a visitor, as a set of hands. Then he can decide who belongs at a military ceremony. Ballard studied me for a long moment. I think he had expected either fury or forgiveness, and I had given him neither. I had given him an assignment. He nodded slowly, and he said he would see that it happened. The truth is that the consequence that landed hardest on Captain Sedgwick was not anything the army did to him. It was the story itself. By lunchtime, it had moved through the entire post, the way these stories do, faster than any order. The protocol officer who walked the Silver Star recipient out of her own ceremony. His whole careful world had been built on optics, on things looking right, and now he was defined forever by the worst optic imaginable. Ballard counseled him privately, off the record but unmistakable. And whatever was said in that room, Sedgwick came out of it a smaller and quieter man. Sergeant Cody Farrow found me before I left the building. He came up with his hat in his hands, and he could barely get the words out. He said he was sorry, that he had known something was wrong and had done it anyway, that he would never forgive himself. And I looked at this kid, 26 years old, who had been given an order by a captain in front of a filling room, and I did not have it in me to be hard on him. I told him the thing I hoped would stick. I said, You followed an order. Next time, look at the person before you follow it. That is the whole job. He nodded like I had handed him something heavy, and I suppose I had. There is a difference between the one who gives the order and the one who carries it, and I have never confused the two. Farrow was not the reason I got walked to the door. He was just the nearest pair of hands, the same way I had once been the nearest pair of hands to a dying man. Hands do what they're told until they learn to decide for themselves. I wanted him to learn. He asked me before he left why I was not angrier. He said it plainly, the way a young person can, without any polish on it. He said, Sergeant, if it was me, I would want somebody's head. And I thought about how to answer him honestly. I told him that anger is a tool, like a tourniquet, and that a tourniquet saves a life when you need it and costs a limb when you leave it on too long. I told him I had learned to use anger for exactly as long as it was useful, and then to take it off before it cost me something I wanted to keep. I do not know if a 26-year-old could really hear that. I'm not sure I could have heard it at 26, but I planted it the way you plant things in young soldiers and trust the weather to do the rest. I left the post that afternoon with a silver star pinned to a civilian dress and a strange, hollow feeling that I did not expect. Because here is what no one tells you about the big moment. The parade ends, the room empties, and you go home to the same leg you woke up with. Time moved the way it does, and to his credit, Captain Sedgwick actually did it. He showed up at the medical center for his day as a set of hands, and then, to everyone's surprise, including his own, he kept coming back. The first day I heard, he arrived expecting to be humiliated. He thought the point was to make him feel small in front of the people he had waved off. But that is not how the medical center works. Nobody had time to stage his humbling. They just put him to work. He pushed wheelchairs, he held doors, he studied a double amputee, a man younger than him, who was learning to take stairs again on 2 new legs and a lot of willpower. And somewhere in that day, Sedgwick saw, for the first time, the exact population he had waved out of his ceremony. Canes and braces and slow, deliberate walks. The people who do not look military until you know what it cost them to still be standing at all. It undid him, quietly. There was no dramatic breakdown. He just came back the next week and the week after that. I heard about most of it secondhand from the cadre and the nurses, because I was not going to hover over the man's penance like a warden. But one detail reached me that I have never forgotten. On his 3rd or 4th visit, one of the patients, a sergeant who had lost most of a hand, asked Sedgwick to help him with the buttons on his shirt, a thing the sergeant could not yet do and hated needing help with. And Sedgwick, who a month earlier could not spare 2 seconds to look at a woman's identification, knelt down and did the buttons, one at a time, and did not rush, and did not make the man feel small for needing it. The nurse who told me about it said Sedgwick's hands were shaking. Quiet hands, I thought. When she told me, he was learning to keep his hands quiet. That is the whole education, right there. It is not about being sorry, it is about what your hands do for a person who cannot do it themselves. My own struggle was less visible and more stubborn. The leg did not fully come back. There is a point in a recovery where the curve flattens, where the improvements get smaller and the doctors start using softer words, and you realize that the version of your body you are getting back is not the version you had. The metal did not fix the leg. Nobody tells you the parade ends and the physical therapy does not. I had to accept that I might never return to a line unit, that the thing I had done for 20 years, the running toward the fire part, might be over. That was the lowest I got. Lower than the ceremony, lower than the injury. Because the injury had been sudden and the ceremony had been someone else's fault. But this was just a slow, quiet door closing on the only identity I had ever wanted. I didn't tell many people how low it got. That is the trap of being the strong one for 20 years. You do not have the muscles for asking. I had spent my whole career being the shoulder, the steady voice, the one who held it together so the wounded could fall apart safely, and I did not know the first thing about doing it in the other direction. So I sat with it alone for longer than I should have. I would come home from therapy and sit in the dark for an hour without turning the lights on, not crying, just sitting, doing the arithmetic of a smaller life and not liking the numbers. There is a particular grief in outliving your own usefulness, or believing you have, and it does not care how many medals are in the drawer. The drawer, in fact, made it worse. All that proof of who I used to be, in a box in a dresser, while the actual me sat in the dark trying to figure out what I was for now. Tamara found me in that low place, and she did not let me stay in it. She has never once let me feel sorry for myself for longer than she thinks is useful. She looked at me and she said, "You saved a corporal with your hands. You think those hands are done just because the leg is?" That sentence turned something over in me. Because she was right. The cadre at the medical center had been circling me for weeks about helping run a peer program, teaching the newer medics and mentoring the wounded soldiers through the invisible part of recovery, the part that has nothing to do with muscle and everything to do with the mind. I had been resisting it because accepting it felt like admitting the field was over. but tomorrow made me see that I was not losing the mission. I was being handed a different one. My quiet hands found a new use. I could not carry a wounded man out of a firefight anymore. But I could sit across from a 19-year-old who had just learned his leg was gone and tell him, from inside my own experience, that his life was not over, and he would believe me, because I had the cane to prove I had walked the road first. That turned out to be the whole secret of the work, not the words. There are no words that fix what those young soldiers were facing, and anyone who pretends there are has never sat in the chair. The thing that helped was the cane. The thing that helped was that I got up slowly, and I favored the leg, and I did not hide any of it. For years I had been taught to project strength, to be the calm center so everyone else could fall apart. And now the most useful thing I owned was my visible, undeniable damage. A 19-year-old will not believe a whole officer telling him it gets better. He will believe a woman with a cane and a silver star telling him it gets different, and that different can be enough, and that the life on the other side of this is smaller in some ways and much larger in others. I could say that and mean it, and he could see that I meant it, because I was living the exact sentence I was asking him to believe. The first soldier I really reached was a kid from a town not far from my own, a quiet one, the dangerous kind of quiet. He would not talk to the chaplain, and he would not talk to the counselor, and he sat through group like a stone. I did not try to crack him. I just sat near him day after day and let him get used to the shape of me. And one afternoon, out of nowhere, he asked me if the leg hurt. First thing he had said in 2 weeks. I told him the truth, that yes, it hurt most days, and that I had made a kind of peace with the hurt that was not the same as the hurt going away. He nodded, and the next day he talked a little more. That was the whole victory. That is what the job is. You do not save them in one dramatic run through the fire. You save them one small, honest sentence at a time, over months, with your quiet hands folded in your lap. There was a moment, a few weeks into Sedgwick's volunteering, when he and I passed each other in a hallway at the center. No grand speech, no dramatic reckoning. He was pushing a wheelchair, and I was carrying a stack of intake folders, and he slowed, and he nodded at me, and he kept working. I let that be enough. Not everything that heals needs to be spoken. Sometimes the apology is just a man showing up on a Tuesday when nobody's making him. The real apology came later, and it was worth accepting because he had earned the right to give it. It was after his volunteer time had quietly become a habit. After he had stopped counting the days he owed and just started coming. He found me in the peer program room one evening while I was stacking chairs, and he did not make excuses, which is the only way an apology is worth anything. He said, I looked at a cane and a dress, and I decided I already knew everything. I have spent 3 weeks learning how wrong a person can be in 10 seconds. I let that sit for a moment. Then I did not give him the clean absolution I think he was bracing for. I gave him something more useful. I told him I was not going to punish him, and I was not going to close the book either. I said, I am not going to punish you. I am going to use you. Keep coming. Because the soldiers in that program needed hands, and he had turned out to have good ones, and the best thing I could do with a reformed man was put him to work. Around the same time, Corporal Mott, the soldier I had saved, came back into my life in a way I did not expect. He was recovering himself from wounds and from the harder thing that comes after, and he joined the peer program, first as a patient and then as a helper. And so the 3 of us ended up in the same room around the same mission. The medic who was walked out of her ceremony, the corporal she saved, and the officer who tried to walk her out. An unlikely triangle that only the army could have assembled. 3 people bound together by the worst and best day of a year. I thought a lot, in that season, about what trust actually is inside an institution as big as the army. I used to think trust meant that the system would never fail you. But the system had failed me, publicly, in front of 200 people. What I came to understand is that trust is not the absence of failure. Trust is whether the thing is big enough to correct itself. The army had failed me at 10 in the morning and stood up for me by 10:15. A captain had gotten me wrong in 10 seconds and spent 3 months getting me right. People can be more than their worst 10 seconds if you leave the door open for them to walk back through. Isaiah and Sedgwick were careful around each other at first, and who could blame them? Isaiah knew the whole story. He knew that the man now stacking chairs beside him was the man who had tried to walk his medic out of her own ceremony, and there was a while where I could see Isaiah deciding whether to hate him on my behalf. I did not tell him how to feel. That would have been unfair to both of them. But one day I watched Isaiah hand Sedgwick a stack of intake folders without being asked, just a small ordinary courtesy between two people doing the same work, and I knew the ice had broken. That is how it actually happens, not with a speech of forgiveness, but with a stack of folders passed hand to hand. Reconciliation is mostly logistics. It is mostly people agreeing, without saying so, to be useful to each other in the same room. I never made them talk about it. To this day, I do not know if they ever discussed that morning directly. I suspect they did not, and I suspect they did not need to. Some things you settle in words. Most things you settle by working next to someone long enough that the old grievance runs out of oxygen. Months on, the peer program had become something real, with a name on the door and a room of its own and a waiting list of soldiers who needed what it offered. I was respected in a new way. Not for the medal, which sat in a drawer at home, but for the work that came after it. That is the respect that lasts, I think. The kind that is not about a single dramatic day, but about showing up, quietly, for a long time. But I would be lying if I said the grief was gone. I still caught myself some mornings, missing the field with a physical ache, missing the version of me who could run. You do not stop grieving the person you were just because you have made peace with the person you are becoming. Both things are true at once. Then the Post asked me to speak at the next awards ceremony, the same theater, about what recognition means. The symmetry was so heavy that even the sergeant major who asked me winced a little as he said it. They wanted me to stand at the same podium I got walked away from. I did not know if that was healing or just a story that liked its own symmetry too much. I almost said no, and then Isaiah Mott said the thing that made up my mind. We were closing up the program room one night, and he told me, finally, the full version of something he had never said out loud. He said, "I do not remember the fire. I remember your voice telling me to stay. I have been staying ever since." And it reframed the whole medal for me. It had never been about the ribbon or the ceremony or the man who tried to walk me out. It was about the fact that this young man was alive to close up a room with me. Alive to say that sentence, alive at all. That was the star. Everything else was just decoration. He told me the rest of it that night, too, the part I had never let myself ask about. He told me he had woken up in a hospital in Germany, not knowing for 3 days whether he had dreamed the whole thing. He told me that when he finally got the story straight, when someone told him a medic had come out into the open 3 times and knelt over him on that road, the first thing he felt was not gratitude, but a kind of terror, because he understood how close it had been, how easily the story could have gone the other way. And then the gratitude came, and it had never left. He said he thought about it every single morning in the first few seconds of being awake before the day started. He said, "You gave me every one of these mornings. I do not waste them." I had to look at the floor for a while after he said that. There is no medal in any drawer in any country that weighs what that sentence weighs. I realized listening to him that I had been carrying the ceremony wrong. I had been carrying it as the day I got humiliated. But Isaiah was carrying the same events as the day the whole room finally understood what I had done for him. Same day, 2 completely different stories, depending on where you stood. He had been sitting in that second row, watching them try to walk his hero out the door, and then watching the room realize its mistake. And for him, it had not been an insult at all. It had been a vindication. His medic, the one nobody in that theater took seriously, turned out to be the reason he was alive to watch. I decided that night to try carrying it his way, so I said yes. The night before the second ceremony, I laid out my Army service uniform, altered now to fit over the brace, a small tailoring miracle that had taken months to arrange. And beside it, I laid the cane. For a long moment, I looked at the two of them, the uniform and the cane, side by side on the bed. For most of the past year, I had felt like I had to choose between them, like the cane made me less of a soldier and the uniform made me a liar about my body. And that night I decided to wear both, on purpose, the uniform and the cane together, because they were both true, and I was done pretending either one canceled the other out. I turned off the light and I was ready. I walked into that theater the second time in uniform and on the cane, and this time no one stopped me. But I was not thinking about myself. I was thinking about the woman who had been stopped a year before in a plain, dark dress, and how much she had not known yet about how the day would end. Captain Sedgwick was there, in the back, part of the team now, older in the way a year makes some people older. Cody Farrow was there too, wiser than the kid who had put a hand near my arm. Neither of them tried to catch my eye or make some private moment out of it. They just stood where soldiers stand, and that was the right thing, and I was glad of it. We had already said everything that needed saying, most of it without words, over a year of stacked chairs and held doors and folders passed hand to hand. I checked in at the same table, by the same doors. A different young officer had the clipboard this time, and she found my name at once, and she smiled and said, "Right this way, Sergeant." Such a small thing, such an ordinary courtesy. It cost her nothing, and it would have cost the man a year ago nothing either. And that was the entire lesson, standing there in the doorway, wearing a smile. I thanked her, and I walked in on my own, and no one reached for my arm. When it was my turn, I walked to the podium, the cane tapping in a silence that felt completely different from the last one. And I told them the story. I told them about a year ago, in this room, without naming the captain, because naming him would have made it about him, and it was never about him. I turned it into the only lesson I wanted those young soldiers to carry out of that theater. I said, "A year ago, in this room, someone looked at a cane and a dress and decided I did not belong. He was not a bad man. He was just in a hurry. Do not be in a hurry with people. The person you are about to wave off might be the one who would have run through fire for you." The room, including the ones who had been there the first time, sat very still. I told them the rest of it too, the part I most wanted them to keep. I said that the uniform is a promise, but it is not the only shape the promise comes in. I said that the day would come for every one of them when their body would stop being what it had been, sooner for some than others, and that when that day came, they would need to know that they were still soldiers, still worth the room, still exactly who they had spent their whole lives becoming. I told them I was standing in front of them on a cane, in a uniform I could barely get on over the hardware in my knee, and that I had never once felt more like a soldier than I did right then. I told them that the measure of a service member is not how they look walking in. It is what they were willing to do when it counted and who they chose to be in the 10 seconds after someone got them wrong. I said, "Look at the person. That is the whole job." It was always the whole job. And I stepped back from the podium, and for a moment nobody moved, and then the room did the thing rooms do when they have been told something true. After I stepped down from the podium, an old sergeant major I had never met found me in the crowd. He had to be close to 60, chest full of ribbons that told their own long story, and he did not say much. He just took my hand in both of his and held it a second longer than a handshake, and he said, "I have been to 1,000 of these. I will remember yours." Then he let go and walked off before I could answer. I do not know his name. I think about that handshake more than I think about the medal. And then the quiet joys, the ones that actually make a life. Coffee with Tamara on a Saturday, arguing about nothing, the same argument we have been having for 20 years, and neither of us wants to win. Watching the program's first graduates walk out the door, steadier than they walked in. Isaiah Mott, thriving, building something out of the years my hands had bought him, back in school now, talking about becoming a medic himself, which is either the highest compliment I have ever been paid, or the universe's idea of a joke, and I have decided to take it as the compliment. A leg that would never be perfect, but carried me just fine. Thank you. With a little help from a gray cane I had stopped hating and started thinking of as a piece of equipment, like any other tool that helps you do the job. The quiet came back, is what I am telling you. The ordinary, unremarkable quiet of a life that works. It is the most underrated thing in the world, and you only understand its value once you have spent a year without it. I did not get revenge. I never wanted it. The captain who tried to walk me out ended up spending a year learning to carry the same people he once dismissed, and that was worth more than any complaint I could have filed. The best kind of justice does not leave a mark. It leaves a better person where a worse one used to be. Here's what I want you to take from this, whoever you are, wherever you are watching from. The best moment of my life was not the medal. It was the silence right before, the moment by those doors when I got to choose who I was going to be. I could have been the woman who yelled. I chose to be the woman who walked. I chose quiet. I have never once regretted it. If you have ever been looked at and dismissed, sorted into a category by someone who did not take the 2 seconds to see you, I need you to know that their shortcut is not the truth about you. You do not have to raise your voice to prove them wrong. Sometimes you just have to keep walking toward the front of the room on whatever leg you have left until they call your name and the whole world has to turn around and look. If you have ever walked into a room that had already decided who you were, I would love to hear how you handled it down in the comments. Did you raise your voice, or did you keep walking? Was there ever a moment when the people who underestimated you had to turn around and finally look? And if you have ever had to build a whole new purpose after the one you planned for slipped away, I want to hear about that too. I read every comment you leave me. If this story meant something to you, hit subscribe and stay a while. There is a chair here for you.